Hey folks, a few days ago we got our first trailer for the next 2D Zelda game called Echoes of Wisdom, and it's coming out in September. Now, I could make multiple videos covering all the Easter eggs in this trailer, or I could talk about how interesting it is that there's finally a Zelda game where you play as Zelda, and I could analyze how she's more of a mage and how that changes combat and puzzle solving from the ground up. But I'm a lore junkie, so my first question was, where does this game fit into the timeline? So that's what I'm gonna try to cover today.
Yeah, but barbecue, Nintendo doesn't even care about the timeline. They're not even bothering to fit the new games into the lore anymore.
Yeah, shut up. We're gonna figure this out as well as we can anyway. Okay, as a first note, the world we see here looks a lot like the one in A Link to the Past, which has led a lot of people to say that Echoes of Wisdom is going to happen after Link's Awakening, somewhere in the Downfall timeline. Most of the 2D games are in the Downfall timeline, so that would make some sense. I disagree. And also, I'm shortening the game's title down to just Echoes because I'm going to be saying it a lot. There's a lot of stuff that we're seeing in the trailer for Echoes that we haven't seen before in the Downfall timeline. The Sea Zora are in this, the Gerudo are also here. We got this clip of Zelda either sneaking or just climbing into Gerudo Town, and neither of those factions were in the Downfall timeline. There's also a village at the gates of Hyrule Castle. Castletown isn't in any of the Downfall timeline games as far as I know. After the timeline split, it's predominantly in the Child timeline, as well as in Spirit Tracks and the Breath and Tears era, but there hasn't been a Castletown in the Downfall timeline before. It is implied in the Zelda 2 artwork that Castletown may have eventually been built in this timeline, but if so, then this game does have to take place near the end of the Downfall timeline, near the time of the original 2 games. Now, there are a few other things that would suggest that Echoes will take place in the Downfall timeline, but the problem is that they aren't very concrete. The first is the presence of the River Zora. The River Zora are these little dudes, and they are almost exclusively seen in the Downfall timeline. But when I say almost exclusively, I do mean almost. The River Zora also appear in Four Swords Adventures, which means that they also do exist in the Child timeline. Another thing that we see in the Echoes trailer that is predominantly in the Downfall timeline is a Trident of Darkness, the kind of weapon that we see Ganon using. This one seems to be a little bit more customized, it's got spikes on both ends, but it's the same idea. The Trident of Darkness is seen in a few of the Downfall games, but it also happens to appear in, once again, Four Swords Adventures in the Child timeline. I would argue that Echoes is going to be in the Child timeline, sometime after Twilight Princess. Whether it's before or after Four Swords Adventures, I'm not sure. Okay, so here's why I think Echoes is in the Child timeline. First, you may have noticed that Link and Zelda are both wearing these new cloaks. Haven't seen these before in any other game. These have a very important aesthetic detail. These sharp swirls are signature to both the Twilight and the Zonai. Now, these cloaks could be referencing either group of entities, but the shading is closer to what we've seen in Twilight Princess than what's in Tears of the Kingdom. So this looks to me like it's very deliberately referencing the Twilight. Link's bow also has the same blocky aesthetic and the same color as the symbols on his cloak. His sword is the same way. Link isn't carrying the Master Sword. At first I thought this was the Goddess Sword, although upon further inspection, the hilt is totally different and also has more Twilight swirls on it. This would all, I think, suggest that this game takes some place after Twilight Princess, which is a Child timeline game. We also see this infectious gateway to another world that's spreading across Hyrule. Inside is a kind of shadow realm of sorts, it looks like, that has these hovering chunks of land. This is somewhat reminiscent of the Twilight Realm, although it may not be the exact same thing, as the color palette is quite different. But it does look more like the Twilight Realm than it does like anything else we've seen before. Between these details and the fact that the Water Zora and the Trident of Darkness both feature in this game, I say that Echoes will probably take place in the same era as Four Swords Adventures. It probably won't be about the same incarnation of Link and Zelda as in Four Swords Adventures, since Link doesn't have the Four Sword and Ganon was already defeated in their lifetime. But a few generations before or after Four Swords is when I think Echoes is going to occur. As a side note, upon closing, you may or may not be familiar with my shadow timeline theory from back in December. It's one of the more successful videos on the channel. In that video, I theorized that there's a hidden timeline split in Majora's Mask that splits the child timeline into two, and that the alternative timeline is where the Zonai first show up. If that theory is true, then Echoes could quite easily be a game set after the Tears Imprisoning War, not to be confused with the Downfall Imprisoning War. If you're not familiar with my shadow timeline theory, feel free to check that video out next. Echoes would fit quite nicely into that theory as well. Anyway, I hope you all have a lovely day. I'd love to hear some alternative theories or your own contributions to whatever argument down in the comments. Until next time, peace out.